Hi, I'm Effie and this is What Effie Reads. A couple of months ago I noticed that there were a number of Peter Pan retellings coming out this year, and I thought it'd be really interesting to try out a few different Peter Pan retellings and kind of put them together. Not all of these books have come out this year, but two of them have definitely come out this year. One of them was out of print for a long time and has just come back into print. And then a few of them have been around for a little while, but I didn't know about them, basically. So first things first, the makeup is inspired by one of the makeup looks that Wendy has in Darling by Kay Ancrum, and I am obsessed. Unfortunately, it hasn't come out quite as dramatic as I hoped it would, but then I am still pretty much a makeup newbie. But it was still fun to do a makeup look inspired by something in a book. So the first Peter Pan retelling that I read this year was Lost in the Netherwoods by Aiden Thomas. And I will say that I'll try and put content warnings for each of these books in the description, because I think every one of these books has got some form of content that could be triggering for people. Lost in the Netherwoods is set some years after Wendy returns from Neverland. However, in Thomas's reimagining, only Wendy returned, her brothers didn't. So she's left to try and come to terms with the fact that they all disappeared but only she came back. And I would say that I had a hard time getting into this book. I don't know if it's because I started the book as an audiobook, and sometimes I find that it can be a little bit tricky to focus with audiobooks. So I switched to physical book, and I did find that I was enjoying it a lot more in physical form. And then there's this brilliant twist in it, and it's kind of like, I'm not sure if I'd say it's a novel twist, but it's one that I hadn't seen explicitly done before, and I loved what Thomas did with it. So that was a really strong start to kind of reading all of these Peter Pan retellings. And then the next Peter Pan retelling that I read was Peter Pan in Neverland by Andrea Lynn Piazza and Nicola Warren. Now this is a children's book, but it's rewritten the Peter Pan story to be really inclusive. So you've got an autistic character, you've got black characters, you've got deaf characters, cerebral palsy, and I'm sure there's other inclusion that I can't think of off the top of my head. So it was really great to see the story reimagined. It still managed to contain a lot of the elements of the story, but also creating a place where every child can see themselves in one of the characters. What I will say about this book is that I am not sure about the autism rep. I've said before, as far as I'm aware, I'm neurotypical, but there have been times where I've questioned that. However, I don't as far as I'm aware, I don't have autism. But the rep within the book felt somewhat stereotypical, as your autistic character was constantly stimming, and the way that they were portrayed, as it almost came across like a tantrum. And I feel like that's being very extreme to try and represent this character. But again, I can't really speak on whether that is good representation. It's just how I felt. And the next Peter Pan retelling that I read was one of my most like I didn't know it was out, but like if I'd known it was out, it would have been like one of my most anticipated releases of the year. Because as soon as I started looking for Peter Pan retellings, I came across this story. But it was out of print, and to the point that it was so in demand that any editions that you could find, you were having to pay upwards of £200. And I think the book's only about 200 pages long. So like novella length and £200 for a copy. But it's now been reprinted, and this book is Peter Darling. And I just thought it was a really clever concept. In this reimagining of the Peter Pan story, Peter Pan is who Wendy truly is. And it was just such a cleverly woven story. And I loved how like Hook was quite three-dimensional as well. And I mean, any book that is unapologetically queer, I'm likely to love anyway. So this was a definite like 5-star, absolutely adored it. So I highly, highly recommend that if you're looking for a Peter Pan retelling. And then we got on to Darling by Kay Ancrum, which was kind of the book that started this all. So Darling is a contemporary retelling of Peter Pan. There are no fantastical elements in it. And it's so incredibly cleverly done. As I was reading it, I wasn't sure what to think of it, but I think it's because I didn't know what was going on. But then as soon as you were revealed what was happening, I was blown away by how smart this book was, and also just how dark it was. I couldn't quite believe it. You had sort of inklings that things weren't quite right, but nowhere near to the extent that was actually revealed. And I can't sing this book's praises high enough. And I'm really excited to see more and more people talking about it. And as well, this book was one that had a lot of brilliant representation in. What I particularly liked is that Ancrum appeared to have done research and sensitively approached the fact that this story has American Indian characters in. And these characters weren't the stereotypical characters that you see in the original Peter Pan story. They were fully fleshed, their tribe was stated, they weren't called the same names that you had in the original Peter Pan story. And it was just expertly crafted, and I'm looking forward to rereading it. hopefully fairly soon, so that I can see all the breadcrumbs that were laid earlier in the story before the big reveal. I also picked up a copy of Cheshire Crossing by Andy Weir and Sarah Anderson, and this is a graphic novel it's a little Every Heart a Doorway, in that it's what happens to Wendy, Alice and Dorothy after they return from their worlds. But also, like, they still have the power to return to their worlds. So they're kind of like, they've got superpowers, which is pretty cool. And this was probably the most like divergent from like a Peter Pan retelling of all of the Peter Pan retellings that I read, because beyond the fact that you've got Wendy and it features Captain Hook and you see Neverland, there isn't much of the Peter Pan story in it. But it's fine. Like, Wendy's a complete badass, so's Dorothy, so's Alice. And it was a really cool story with loads of like pop culture Easter eggs in. And I'd love to see more from the world, but I think there is only the one graphic novel. But it also feels like it's set up that there could be more from this story. So you never know. And then I've got one more novel that I managed to finish, and then I'm going to touch on a couple that I didn't manage to finish. So I read Pan, Lost and Found by Gina L Maxwell, because I thought, well, let's sprinkle in a slightly more adult, maybe smutty one. So this story is another contemporary. It doesn't have fantastical elements, but again, Maxwell very cleverly incorporated the original story elements, like the giving a thimble as a kiss, and you see all of the lost boys. But I think where this story didn't work for me, at least for the like majority of the story, is that you don't feel invested in their story, because Pan and Wendy, like, they meet at 12 and then you're seeing them again at 26, and you get little bits of like flashback and backstory, but you don't see them falling in love with each other. And because they are already lusting after each other, when you see them at 26, you also don't really get the lust either. So as the story progressed and you do get a bit more of their feelings, I felt like I could get into it more. But at least initially, I was like, I need to be more invested in these characters. This just isn't doing anything for me. But I'm really excited to read Hook, because I think that one is going to be, you're actually going to see the characters like start to develop their feelings for one another. And what I'm currently the Peter Pan retelling that I'm currently reading, that I'd hoped to finish prior to making this video, but I had a particular date that I wanted this video to go up, so unfortunately I ran out of time, and it's Straight On Till Morning by KJ Sutton. And so far this book is so smutty. Like, my best friend said, like, she'd looked at a review and it said like 2% in and there's smut. And there is 2% into this book and you've got smut. But it's good smut. Like, you know how sometimes you come across smut and you're like, not really invested. And it's like 2% in, these characters have like literally just met. But you still feel invested. I think because you feel the desire and the lust. So far it seems to be okay. I kind of go back and forward on whether the language feels a bit stiff and stale. Like, it's deliberately written in a way that like is trying to put across that it's like authentically Victorian. But at times it does feel a bit forced. But I'm also really enjoying it. And if I manage to finish it or have any more thoughts before this video goes up, I will edit in a clip here. But otherwise, that is all of the Peter Pan retellings I read. Let me know if you've read any of them, and let me know if what I've said about them makes you want to pick any of them up. And until next time, bye!